We're talking about the Talmud, and as I said, we'll need a lot of time to talk about the Talmud. But I will use now a book called Mevoah Talmud, a work by Rabbi Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon. It's printed at the end of the Masechet Brachot in the Talmud, and when you look at the title, it says Mevoah Talmud le Rabbi Shmuel Nagid. It's attributed by mistake to Rabbi Shmuel Nagid, who lived about 200 years after Rabbi Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon. Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon lived in Babylonia, in Iraq, in the 9th century, and Shmuel Nagid is very famous. For some people, he's famous because there are streets named after him in Yerushalayim and in Tel Aviv. But those who really know, Rabbi Shmuel Nagid was a statesman, a general, poet. He wrote many books of halakha, but not the one that we're reading now. This was in Granada. He was the general of the Khalif Khabus in Spain, in Granada. So it says in Mevoah Talmud this: Amar mechaber Talmud nihlak nishne halakim Mishnah ufirush Mishnah. As I mentioned earlier, it says that in the Talmud they have two parts. One is the Mishnah, written and edited sort of by rabbi-ovadia Nasi, and the commentary on the Mishnah. המשנה היא נקראת תורה שבעל פה, והיא יסוד התורה שהעתיקו ממשה רבנו עליו השלום עד ימי רבנו הקדוש עליו השלום. It says Mishnah is the oral law, and it was transmitted orally from Moshe to the time of rabbi-ovadia Nasi. כי כתבה למען תעמוד ימים רבים, פן תשכח מלב הקוראים וטובת. Rabbi-ovadia Nasi wrote it down because he was afraid that the knowledge is going to be forgotten. But as we mentioned, it's not everything was given to Moshe as it is written in the Mishnah. It's the product of many years of analyzing and discussing and organizing the material. He says הפירוש הזה יתחלק גם הוא לשני חלקים, האחד הלכה מקוימת והשני הלכה דחויה. It says, and in the commentary on the Mishnah, you will find different types of halachot. Some of them are what he called mekuyemet, sustained or approved, and the other one is rejected. One, it says, and there's very few examples of the first one, and that is a law or halacha where you have no mahloket, they have no dispute, everybody agrees on. We have very few chapters in the Mishnah where everything is without argument. One of them, actually, we read every morning, those who read Korbanot before the prayer, and you read Ezeu mekomam shel zevachim kodesh kodashim shehitatan batzafon. There's a whole Mishnah that speaks about what is the exact location for slaughtering and sacrificing each one of the sacrifices. And it's there are different opinions why it was included in the tefillah in that part. So, of course, originally it was put there in order to fulfill the obligation of Talmud Torah. But there are hundreds of chapters in the Mishnah. Why they chose this one? So they say because it deals with sacrifices, and the prayers come to substitute for the sacrifices. But of all the chapters that deal with sacrifices, why in particular this one? So some people say because it's one of the only chapters in the Mishnah where there's no dispute, where there's no, he says this and he says that. Everybody agrees, so it's nice to open the tefillah from an atmosphere of agreement and not of dispute. Now, Rabbi Shmuel ben Hofni raises this question: אם יטעון הטוען, למה כתב רבנו הקדוש עליו השלום דברים שאינם הלכה, ולא מוטב לכתוב דבר הלכה? He says, if you have disputes, make a final decision. As rabbi-ovadia Nasi, you have the authority. Make the final verdict and write only that which applies to, which is relevant. Why do you have to tell me this one has this opinion and the other one has that opinion? Because anyway, we're not going to follow it. It says, תוכל להשיבו, כי החכמים הקדמונים, כל אחד ואחד העתיק לנפשו מה שלמד, בין דבר שהוא הלכה, בין שאינו הלכה. It says, the generations prior to rabbi-ovadia Nasi memorized, as we mentioned, memorized all that they learned, including the discussion. And when he came to write it down, he had to maintain the format in which it was given. So no one could say what you're saying is wrong because we've never heard of it. Meaning you have to track the history of the law. ואם יאמר, ישיבו שאינה הלכה מקוימת. And if he says, I have a different tradition, they say, yes, you have that, but it was disputed, it was rejected. וכן אמרו חז"ל המסכת העדיות, למה הוזכרו דברי יחיד בין דברי אבני בטלה? שאם יבוא אדם ויאמר כך וכך שמעתי, יאמרו לו מאיש פלוני שמעת, כלומר ואינה הלכה. So they say, why, if you have the opinion of the minority versus the majority, why do you mention the minority opinion? And that, it says, in order to be able to discuss with people who come and say, this is what I've heard, they say, yes, you've heard the opinion of this rabbi, but it was rejected. Not everybody agrees with Rabbi Shmuel ben Hofni on that. Some say that the reason that the opinion of the minority was recorded is that if you, in cases of need, you could rely on it. Or in other words, when you have a dispute among the rabbis of the Mishnah, it means that they had no clear tradition on what is the biblical law, right? Because if they knew with clarity that this is the biblical law, they cannot dispute and say, this is how you do it, this is how. I mean, either it's something that they started, I mean, the whole, for example, B'memad Likin, that we read Erev Shabbat, what type of oil you light Shabbat candles with. There are so many disputes in this chapter, right? And so if you come and ask, wait a second, but what is the biblical law? Why are there so many disputes? The answer is very clear. There's no biblical law. The Torah never says to light Shabbat candles. It's rabbinical law. The rabbis instituted the idea of lighting Shabbat candles to make sure that there's peace and joy at home, that the house is lit, the table is set, etc. And even the laws at the end of this chapter that deal with what you're allowed to do until the last minute on Erev Shabbat are rabbinical and not biblical. On the other hand, if you have a dispute on a biblical question, right, most probably you have to say that the opinion, the minimal opinion is the correct one, and other opinions added on it. But that's when you would go into the thick of the legal discussion. And then he mentions he says that the commentary has 21 categories, which I'm not going to go into. There's different types of questions, different type of answers. And here is a very important statement that unfortunately is forgotten in many of the yeshivot today, or you could say the Orthodox world in general sort of completely ignored. That's made of Rav Shmuel ben Hofni Gaon, who lived really shortly after the conclusion of the Talmud, or not the conclusion. There was never an official conclusion of the Talmud. I would have to say that in parentheses, and I'll go back to it. The Talmud is, as I said, considered the fundamental book of halakha for Jews. Everybody studies this, everybody goes back to review what it says. And people think that it was edited, right? You would assume that if it's the legal codex, someone edited the text and cleaned anything that doesn't belong. But that's not true. There was a period of about 200 years called the period of the Savoraim, where rabbis kept editing and adding and changing and discussing without putting their names in the text. So it's a hidden layer that you don't know exactly where it came from, and causes also a lot of problems in understanding the Talmud. Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi, who I mentioned yesterday in the previous class, tried to do sort of to clean that, and then Maimonides also had his approach, but that is one of the main obstacles in approaching the Talmud. Now, the other thing is that the Talmud includes many segments that have nothing to do with halakha. There are moral, ethical teachings, there are stories, interpretation of the Tanakh, and a lot of them also seem fantastic, seem like imaginable and not realistic. For example, there are stories about a rabbi who was upset by another person, and he looked at him, Natan bu'inav v'asa'o gar shel atzamot, and all that was left from the other person was a heap of bones. Then, you have stories about people and animals of gigantic proportions and exaggerated numbers. I mentioned once a midrash from Masechet Echa, from Midrash Echa, that says the book of Lamentations, right? So he speaks about the destruction of Yerushalayim. It says in Yerushalayim there were 24 plazas, and in each plaza there were 24 marketplaces, and in each marketplace there were 24 exits, and in each exit there were 24 houses, 24 courtyards. In each one of these courtyards there were kiflaim kiyotzei Mitzrayim, twice as many people as those who left Mitzrayim, meaning 1.2 people. If you do the hashbon, 24 times 5, to the power of 5, you will come to something like 360 trillion. It's a crazy number. So obviously it's an exaggeration. But some even with that, say everything that's written in the Talmud should be taken literally. And it's Alachah Moshe Misidai. What is the danger of that? The danger of that, which Maimonides also mentions later, is this. If you insist that all this is true and literal, when someone finds a fault, and let's say finds the fault with solid scientific evidence, or with manuscripts that survived and showed things differently, that person would say, oh, if this is wrong as well. Right? It's like if you sell a package and you say it all goes together. Once one part fails, the whole, and it's very common today. I've seen websites and writings by people who were in the yeshivot and left the yeshivot, and their arguments, they say, oh, the Talmud is false because there are exaggerated statements and things that go against nature. For example, give me one example. The Talmud speaks of animals that grow from trees, birds which grow from trees, and it also says that some birds are half mud and half water, and that there's a creature that is half soil and half animal, all kind of things like that. Now, all these things, the rabbis of the Talmud did not claim to say that they are naturalists or zoologists or anything like that. They, just like rabbis today, they have their field, and sometimes they will have to rely on scientists to get a hard science, right? Hard scientific facts. So did the rabbis at the time. The problem was with science, not with the rabbis. They had their science came from two great Roman scientists, Pliny, the young Pliny and Pliny the Elder. They're very famous, and they observed nature in a certain way. For example, they saw that bats fly off from trees, so they assumed that bats grow in trees. That was the birds that grow in trees. They tried to find out where flies come from to meat, so they covered meat with. They took a bowl with meat, covered it with the thin fabric, and waited to see what happens. And sure enough, after a while, there were maggots in the meat. So they came to the conclusion that there is such a thing as spontaneous creation, that those maggots or those flies were born out of the meat. What they didn't know, and if they would have observed it constantly, they would see little flies coming and laying their eggs through the fabric. They're able to penetrate the fabric and lay eggs. So the rabbi said whatever they said because they had the science of the time. Now, people today come to these statements and they say, oh, the Talmud says that bugs or mosquitoes or flies could form out of thin air or out of meat. And it's nonsense. And since this is nonsense or this is not true, let's get rid of the whole Talmud. And you have to realize this is not the case. You have to be able to sift and filter through it. It is true that many halachic authorities today are very afraid to touch anything. They're sort of like drew a line that science should not cross that line when we study Gemara, because they're afraid that if you knock out certain things, you'll keep on with scientific methods knocking out other things. So that's what they call a slippery slope. But that is another issue we'll get in the future. So what Rav Shmuel says here is this: Haggadah. Says there's a segment of the Talmud called Haggadah, like Haggadah Shel Pesach. It means midrash, narrative, commentary, not halacha. It says Haggadah, וכל פירוש שיבוא בתלמוד על שום עניין שלא יהיה מצווה, whatever commentary you find in the Talmud that is not about practical law, זוהי Haggadah, ואין לך ללמוד ממנה אלא מה שיעלה על הדעת. This is midrashic or commentary or interpretation of the narrative of the Torah, and you could only learn from it that which makes sense. It's important. Rav Shmuel ben Gaon says, trust your senses, trust your logic. If you read a certain story in the Gemara and it doesn't make sense, put it aside. You don't learn from that. And that's, by the way, it's typical to the school of the Gaonim in Bavel. That is a school that came after the Talmud for about, we could say, from the 7th century to the 11th century, for about 400 or 500 years. They had the monopoly over learning and teaching Torah, and their students became the rabbis and the leaders of Sephardic Jewry. And that's why all Sephardim, all non-Ashkenazi Jews, we refer to ourselves as Sephardim, even if our ancestors didn't come directly from Spain, from Sepharad, because the knowledge of this approach of combining science and learning of Torah started in Bavel and continued in Spain, and together spanned about 1,500 years. And that's how we were all influenced, especially the Jews of course, Babylonia, Spain, and Morocco, or North Africa in general. They were all connected. This was if you look at the Middle Ages, early medieval times, from the 7th century to at least to the 15th century or 13th century, that was the route that Jews from Iraq would travel through Spain and through Morocco, through North Africa, and then back. So, for example, Rabbi Donash ben Labrat, Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Maimonides, said, where do they live? Hard time in the Egypt or Bavel, Spain, Morocco. That's why we all refer to ourselves as Sephardim. So he says, when learning Talmud, use logic. If it doesn't make sense, you reject it. ויש לך לדעת שכל מה שקיימו חז"ל הלכה בעניין מצווה שהיא מפי משה רבנו עליו השלום שקיפל מפי הגבורה, אין לך להוסיף עליו ולא לגרוע ממנו. When it's established that the rabbis had a tradition regarding the commentary of a law that came by tradition from Moshe, that's also, it's a process that you have to make sure that each part of this is confirmed, that you don't change. אבל מה שפרשו בפסוקים כל אחד כפי מה שנזדמן לו ומה שראה בדעתו. But what they made, when they wrote commentary on the text, listen to that. כל אחד כפי מה שנזדמן לו. It was not necessarily a deliberate effort of sitting and writing commentary, but rather during their study or during their life, they had an idea of this, an idea on that, and they wrote it down. וכפי מה שעלה בדעתו, and it was maybe appropriate for their stage in life or their circumstances. So very important. It's not binding. It says. So when people come and say, Rivka was 3 years old when she married Yitzhak. It's my pet peeve, midrash, right? When they say Rivka was 3 years old when married Yitzhak, you ask Rav Shmuel, he says complete nonsense. Complete nonsense. Doesn't make sense. Goodbye. When they tell you Yitzhak was 37 years when he was bound by his father and about to be sacrificed, Rav Shmuel would say complete nonsense. Don't look at me like that. Complete nonsense. It is impossible, if you look at the text of the Torah, to assume that Abraham is being told, go sacrifice your son, and this son is 37 years old. It does not make sense. There's no proof for it in the Torah. This is what Rav Shmuel says. מה שיעלה על הדעת מן הפירושים האלה לומדים אותם והשאר אין סומכים עליהם. You only accept that which makes sense, and the rest you have to reject. You have to, okay, nice commentary. It's not binding, no pun intended for the binding of Yitzhak, but it's important to have that in mind. So this is, like I said, the introduction of Rav Shmuel ben Hofni to the Talmud. We'll speak a little bit more about the Talmud tomorrow. Baruch Adonai, Le'olam amen.